Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Good morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. That music means it's the last radio hour of the week. And on this July 7th, 2023, I'm joined by Dean Matt Spalding. He helms the graduate school in D.C., the Kirby Center for Hillsdale College. And he is also a board member of New College, which puts Matt Spalding in a very interesting position in the aftermath of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, because that case dealt with both a private college, Harvard, and a public college, the University of North Carolina. And Matt's got his fingers in the management of both. Good morning, Dean Spalding. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. How are you? I'm doing great. I'm actually in a good mood after this Supreme Court session.
Oh, boy, am I ever. I am telling everyone, let's start broad, that this is the end of the Roe era officially. The Roe era is much more than the abortion jurisprudence that grew out of Roe and Roe v. Wade, but it's 50 years of terrible law and confused law and misguided law and blindfolded law and legislating from the bench. And I think it's over, Dean Spalding. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. Not only the fact that, first of all, I think this affirmative action decision is the crucial decision in this term, but the fact that that decision essentially reversed 50 years of bad law and Dobbs reversed 50 years of bad law go directly to your point. But more generally, the series of cases, I mean, on free speech in particular, but also this case on reversing the Biden student loans. These are good constitutional arguments. And even though some people will point, well, they didn't do this, that, and the other, the turn has happened, I think. And if this continues, if this is what we're seeing, if this is the logic being played out, because I think there's some very large implications in these cases about where this court looks to be going. If that is true, then we have actually seen a tectonic shift, and
that's it.
Is turning the corner.
I've been teaching con law since 1995, and we always talk about the end of the Lochner era, and that is the era of free market. Mr. Spencer's statistics is that era, and it led to a lot of bad law, and Lochner came to a conclusion probably in West Coast Hotel, but other people date it to different times. But what they need to know is that there was a switch in time that saved the nine, and the court abandoned 50 years of jurisprudence and went to a new jurisprudence, deferential to the executive branch and the Congress. Now, after a 50-year period, what I'll call the Roe era, like the Lochner era, it's over. It's done because there are 6 judges committed to history and tradition, Matt Spalding. How's that make you feel?
No, it makes me feel great. And rather than deferring to the executive or deferring to some particular thing, they're now deferring to the Constitution, and they're deferring to Congress. They're looking at institutionally, and there's an underlying attack here, I think, in the affirmative action cases, the Congress cases, moving towards Chevron cases. They're not deferring to expertise in a way, which is a reversal, not merely of 50 years of jurisprudence, but is a deep attack on the kind of the progressive view of modern political thinking, as opposed to making clear and forthright arguments based on an understanding of the Constitution and its meaning in our political lives. That is huge, monumental shift. And I think we see that throughout all of these decisions in this term.
And this is why the left is immediately pushing to delegitimize the court and to get back to legislating from the bench with a majority they control via the expansion of the Supreme Court, which I believe, by the way, is the end of the rule of law and therefore may be unconstitutional given the history and tradition. While the fixed number of justices was up for grabs until after the Civil War, it stopped at 9. and it hadn't moved in 150 years. And I believe history and tradition would look very, very dimly on any statute attempting to expand the Supreme Court. But I'm an outlier on that, Dean Spalding. What do you think?
Well, in general, I would agree with you. In particular, I think that could be changed. But the point is, it's crystal clear that the reason it's coming up now, as the same reason it came up under Franklin Roosevelt, is precisely to change the makeup of the court to achieve certain outcomes. That has deep constitutional and political problems. But the general point here is that the left is heating up that rhetoric against the court, precise because I think the hard left, especially the postmodern left, has already given up on the rule of law, broadly speaking, and it's just becoming more and more obvious that it's all about outcomes. I think these cases, especially the dissents in the affirmative action case, make that very clear. And the attempt to revive that by this Roberts majority is also very clear. And protecting the court as an institution, protecting the court as part of three branches that in turn uphold and defend the Constitution, I think is where the whole game lies.
And Matt, I want people to understand, we're not talking about Dobbs only, the abortion decision. We're not talking about West Virginia versus EPA only. That's the major question doctrine. We're not talking about Sackett, which is about the abuse by the bureaucracy of individual right. We're not talking about just affirmative action. We're talking about a wholesale attack on the court, not over one decision, but over the loss of authority by the elite decision-making class back to the elected representatives. That's where it needs to go. That's where it needs to stay. And boy, is the left upset because they have ruled indirectly through elites for 50 years.
Absolutely right. And again, even to broaden what you just said, it's not merely an attack on the court per se. It's an attack on the whole constitutional system, which is the rule of law. And if we lose that, the game is over. And they've been working at that since the progressive era, since after the Civil War, since they've been pushing back against that. They've been trying to break down all those institutions. And I think they thought they had the Supreme Court taped to do what they wanted it to do with elite rule, which in turn would defer and allow the executive branch to essentially rule at will through formal expertise and bureaucracies in the administrative state. I think they're being upset here on all of those counts, not only in terms of direct constitutional understanding of the 14th Amendment in this case, but also in the role of Congress in major political questions and doctrines, reviving that, and in pushing back the kind of czarist rule through the modern executive. On all fronts, we have now engaged on a much broader discussion and debate about the very nature of the rule of law and the very nature about how we go about ruling ourselves. And I think the court is primed and set up, especially in one thing I will emphasize when we get into this more, in Thomas's concurrence, which is a beautifully written concurrence that goes to the heart of the matter. I think that there's a much larger movement going on, and this court is reviving a proper understanding. They have some internal debates here and there, and they're going back and forth on particular cases. But generally speaking, they're clearly moving in the direction of reestablishing the rule of law understood as a constitutional matter, which is to say that the three institutions have a role to play in upholding the Constitution according to their duties and responsibilities.
The attack for many years on the attack for many years on Chief Justice Roberts and on Mitch McConnell. My friend Mark Levin, and he is a dear friend, called me a rhino this week because I wanted to point out Chief Justice Roberts has been saying the same thing about race forever, which is the way to end discrimination based on race is to stop discriminating based on race. And the chief is right on almost everything, and I agree with him almost always. And Mitch McConnell saved the Constitution when he held open the vacancy so that Donald Trump could send up first Neil Gorsuch and then two more justices. But Mark gets mad at me for that. What do you think about that the unsung hero of this moment is Senate Leader Mitch McConnell?
I think in terms of Mitch McConnell, the political matter on those seats, you're correct on that. I think on the question on Justice Roberts, I think that there's, to some extent, I'm still getting him figured out. He's clearly an institutionalist. I don't like some of his decisions. I like some of them. This decision was spot on, and I think on this question, on the question of race and affirmative action, if you go back in his career and his earlier decisions, even before he's on the Supreme Court, He is solid on this question, and it comes ringingly clear here. So I think that the criticism, and there are criticisms even of the affirmative action decision as to it doesn't go too far. It's not clear enough. It's not decisive enough. I think part of it is we've got to step back and look at the larger thing and not miss the forest for the trees. How you overturn cases, sometimes you're very clear, sometimes you're not. There is something called jurisprudence. I don't always agree with Roberts. I don't always understand his institutionalism completely, as you explained to me. But having said that, the movement of what's going on here, this case in particular, I think is overwhelmingly important.
And when we come back, we're going to talk about the 14th Amendment and what it was intended to do and why Justice Jackson Brown is wrong about what options are left for people who want to consider race where there have been race-specific injuries done. She's just wrong. And we'll come back with Dean Matt Spalding. Don't go anywhere except to hillsdale.edu. If you want an application to the best college in America, go to hillsdale.edu and get it in, because it's going to be crowded in that line. Hillsdale.edu, all the dialogues collected over at iTunes, Hillsdale Dialogues. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Dean Matt Spalding helms the Kirby Center, Hillsdale's lantern of the D.C. Beltway. Hillsdale.edu for everything Hillsdale. All the Hillsdale Dialogues, back to, there are 800 of them, are collected at hughforhillsdale.com. They're also at iTunes. Matt Spalding, I want to do the practical thing first. When Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard was handed down, did it change anything at Hillsdale? Will it change anything at New College, on which you will serve as the Board of Trustees member?
Good question. I can answer the New College one first. It won't directly. The admissions process at New College, as far as we can tell, and as far as I can tell, does not have a system the way Harvard or University of North Carolina do. And we are actually in the process of erasing anything that's possibly there. One thing I would mention, looking beyond the implications of this particular case, is that, and I think what this is actually going on in the dissent back and forth between Thomas and Jackson especially, is that fewer and fewer colleges actually have formal processes the way Harvard and UNC do, and they've actually been shifting over time, especially of late, very recently, to an alternative. And that alternative is called diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is looking at not just admissions, but now shifting to hiring and training and faculty and operations across the board. And that, I think, is the growing problem. And at any public university where you're not explicitly, clearly stating you're opposed to discrimination, that's what is growing and growing very rapidly.
I want people to understand, if you are a state actor, all right, if you belong to the state, if you are run by the state, and by that I mean the federal government or any of the 50 states or any of the territories of the United States, and you use race or gender to award benefits or inflict penalties, you are violating the Constitution. That's it in a nutshell, Matt Spalding. Agree or disagree?
I agree, which is why I think the implications of this decision go vastly beyond merely formal admission programs like Harvard and UNC. And so DEI, I think, is now on the chopping block. We as one of our first acts as trustees, got rid of all our DEI programs at New College. We just abolished them because New College was actually formed by Congregationalists who wanted to have a school in segregated Florida based on non-discrimination. So we went back to that principle. But that whole approach of DEI, which I think is the modern alternative to affirmative action, where a lot of schools are shifting, and as well as companies and other entities, I think that is brought into question precisely by this decision in the same way that you've suggested here. You can't discriminate based on race or sex. At Hillsdale,
or religion. Or religion.
Or religion. At Hillsdale, that's not an issue because we were an abolitionist college. We forswore that in our founding documents. We cannot discriminate. We took in women. We took in blacks from the very beginning. And we do not keep the records of our students in terms of their racial makeup. That's why we don't take any state or federal funds. because we believe that violates a core principle of our very existence. Unless you're clear on that matter, and here's the clear distinction between a Hillsdale, private, but also the distinction between Hillsdale and other public colleges for that matter, and a lot of public schools which have been caught up and trapped in this affirmative action world for too long and now are being pulled into the DEI world. Unless you're clear, you're going to be pulled into that world more and more and more, which is why, again, this decision is so crucially important in not only stopping affirmative action, but also trying to stop in its rising, this new birth, or this new life of this DEI alternative. I think all of that is now fundamentally in question. Affirmative action, I think, is over and is going to spin out and die off. There is no loophole in Justice Roberts' majority opinion. And now the new battle shifts to what Thomas and Jackson were debating, which is essentially about systemic racism in a broader category that she wants to move to. And I think that is deeply problematic, but also deeply, deeply suspect for the same principled reasons as affirmative action is unconstitutional.
When we come back, we're going to review Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion, which is the concise history of race and the Constitution. And more importantly, we're going to jump to the discussions between Justice Jackson, Brown, and Justice Thomas, because as Matt Spalding has correctly pointed out, those two conversations are fascinating. All right, the Roberts opinion is the tour de force, and the dueling opinions of Thomas and Jackson Brown are fascinating. I'll be right back with Dean Spalding as we talk about Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the three opinions that matter, Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Justice Jackson Brown. Stay tuned.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
Welcome back, America. I am Hugh Hewitt. Matt Spalding is Dean of the Hillsdale Graduate School of Statesmanship in Washington, D.C. He helms the Kirby Center. He's also a member of the New College Board of Trustees, appointed by Governor Ron DeSantis to that. And we are talking about last week's decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. Dean Spalding, if I could, for the benefit of the Steelers fans, briefly say, the Civil War ended in 1865 with more than 600,000 Americans killed in combat, many millions more wounded or destroyed. The wealth of the country greatly leveled the South in wrecked condition. A year later, the 14th Amendment was proposed. People need to go to the U.S. Constitution Center to read it. And it was ratified in 1868. So it entered into our basic fundamental law in 1868. Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion, writes this paragraph. At first, meaning after 1868, at first, this court embraced the transcendent aims of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Quote, what is this? We said of the clause in 1880, quote, but declaring that the law in the state shall be the same for black as for the white, that all persons, whether colored or white, shall stand equal before the laws of the United States. And then it goes on to say the broad and benign provisions of the 14th Amendment apply to all persons. We unanimously declared 6 years later its hostility to race and nationality, which in the eyes of the law is not justified. Despite our early recognition of the broad sweep, Roberts continues, of the Equal Protection Clause, this court, alongside the country, quickly failed to live up to the clause's core commitments. For almost a century after the Civil War, state-mandated segregation was in many parts of the nation a regrettable norm. This court played its own role in that ignoble history, allowing in Plessy v. Ferguson the separate but equal regime that would come to deface much of America. He goes on to explain that ended with Brown v. Board, but it didn't end in practice. It took many years to eradicate intentional use of race in a negative way, Matt Spalding. And indeed, to this very day, if we find someone using race to inflict a penalty on someone, that is actionable. It is actionable under the 14th Amendment to the state. It's actionable under the Section 1983 statute. You cannot discriminate based on race, ethnicity, and religion ever, and very rarely based on gender. Is that a fair summary of everything?
That was quite good, and that is a wonderful passage from Robert's majority opinion. And let me put it in even if I can simpler form for a moment. Please. And just broaden it even further than that. The founding document that informs the Constitution is the Declaration of Independence, and it says that all men are created equal. Equality in a fundamental way, in that deepest sense of we are equally human beings and equally can self-govern and equally have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the essential bedrock of self-government, but also the rule of law, because that's the grounding of consent. It's that principle that gives life to this whole American experiment and regime.
Matt,
the flaw of that in the beginning was the continued existence of slavery. That is the great sin at the heart, if you will, the problem, the barbaric thing that existed. The Constitution made broad compromises, which we could talk about at greater length, but I think they were prudent compromises. That did not settle the matter. It plays out, becomes a civil war. The Civil War won that battle on the battlefield, but because of how Reconstruction plays out as a political matter, they have to then pass a Civil Rights Act, which is vetoed by a president, and eventually they have to override that with a constitutional amendment. The argument in Chief Justice Roberts' decision and in Justice Thomas's concurrence is that we must understand that the 14th Amendment is a continuation, a completion of that arc of the principle of equality stated in the Declaration being codified into the Constitution. And that is the essential principle that is informing our movement forward. The court misinterpreted the Reconstruction amendments for a long time. The darkest moment was the Plessy decision. The dissent in the Plessy decision by Justice Harlan was the bright point, which everyone, including the dissenters, point to, although the dissenters want to misinterpret what Harlan's message was. But Harlan reminded the country, and Roberts and Gorsuch and Thomas are all harking back to that the Constitution is colorblind. We will allow no caste system in this country. That is the heart of the matter, and they're reviving it. Harlan is being revived here, and that is now becoming the majority opinion on the court, which is to return the country to its fundamental, clear principles.
And we're going to move to the concurrence and the dissent in a moment, but I want people to understand. There is a canon and there's an anti-canon in con law. The canon is Marbury versus Madison, which establishes judicial review anticipated in the Federalist 78, and Brown v. Board, which returns the idea of the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution. I would add in the canon Dobbs. In the anti-canon, you've got Dred Scott, Plessy v. Ferguson, Korematsu, and I would argue Roe and Casey. And Randy Barnett and Josh Blackman, two brilliant guys, came up with this category distinction between the anti-canon, the worst decisions of the Supreme Court, and the best and most important decisions. And I think Students for Fair Admissions is going to enter into the canon, Matt. But I am reminded of what Ben Franklin said upon exiting the Constitutional Convention. What do we have? A republic if we can keep it. We almost gave it away, but the end of the Roe era is returning us to the republic where prudence will matter. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. I think this particular case is going to take a little bit to see what happens. We cannot immediately see right now, but I think you're generally right. But more importantly, I think this court if you put Dobbs and this decision, other decisions together, is putting us back into a court and a constitutional system informed by the canon of constitutional law that you refer to, which I would point out is a general matter for the general citizen, reorients our legal system back to the Constitution itself in its most fundamental way.
And they will continue that when the Chevron doctrine is overturned and with the major questions doctrine.
The logic of this playing out is precisely going in that direction. That's what I mean by seeing this play out for a little bit. But if that I think is where we're going. I think it's clearly signaled here on a number of fronts, and I think there's nothing here that prevents that from now playing out. And that is a huge and monumental shift in favor of the Constitution, of constitutional government, and the self-government of the American people.
Now, the debate between Justice Brown Jackson and Justice Thomas matters a great deal. The best defense of Justice Brown Jackson, because her own opinion is length and turgid and just not very particularly well written, but the point of it is that systemic racism empowers states to take into account disparate impacts on race. It does not. That's incorrect. And Justice Thomas answers. Jonathan Cohn at the Huffington Post defended Justice Brown Jackson and her focus on systemic racism and disparate impact. But Justice Thomas says, no, no, no. Matt Spalding, isn't that the heart of their debate, their back and forth?
I think you're absolutely right. But to his credit, Chief Justice Roberts, I think, picks up and makes a subtle cut at this as well. The debate we're seeing now between, which I think is moving beyond affirmative action, which is where the modern left is wanting to go, is it's about systemic racism. I mean, this goes back to the current debates in articles and books you see coming from people like Ibram Kendi, that there's a larger systemic societal racism that's going on here that goes all the way back to the beginning. Justice Jackson says that it's intergenerational transmission of inequality, and it really starts at the very beginning, echoes of the past, and exists today. The problem with that, first of all, I think that's historically inaccurate and just not correct reading of American history. But more importantly, the Constitution is not distinguished in that way. And Justice Roberts reminds us, but also then Justice Thomas, I think, really drives this home that the whole essence of constitutional government, grounded in equality, is precisely this idea that it has to be based on individual injustices that are corrected by the rule of law system. It's not the job of justices, especially, this may be a legislative matter in some circumstances, but for justices, they're not doing sociological experiments about broad categories of classes and races and castes. This is precisely the turn that Thomas very eloquently criticizes when he talks about the fact that, well, what do you do about the fact that admissions requirements in the 1920s were designed to limit the numbers of Jews in college? You can't be going about picking racial winners and losers in your politics somehow to affect a larger societal injustice that you somehow perceive. That's not what the rule of law is all about at all. But that's precisely where the modern left, I think, wants to go, which is why I think DEI is of great interest to them. And I think this decision, by pointing out that no, there are injustices, there are inequities that are to be addressed. Well, the injustices are addressed in the legal system on a case-by-case basis, but the larger inequities, those are can be addressed through legislative matters and broader categories. Justice Thomas points us directly towards an older understanding of doing things affirmatively, which is how you design programs that expand opportunities for everyone. His way out, which he says, his way out is a colorblind constitution. Justice Jackson's way out, which he says this is the way out of this problem, is essentially, and Sotomayor, they both say, well, we actually need more discrimination in order to correct past discrimination. That's just an absurd argument, which I think that Chief Justice Roberts, backed up by Justice Thomas, have with crystal clear words. That is not to be tolerated, because that is a fundamental violation of our Constitution, of our laws, and our most sacred founding document, and the very principle behind this country. And I think that broader debate comes out especially in that dissent between Jackson's dissent and Justice Thomas's concurrence. That
Jackson, Brown, and Thomas need to be read in tandem. But when we come back, they've been translated by Jonathan Cohn, best for Jackson Brown. Jonathan Cohn at Huffington Post. And everywhere, Clarence Thomas doesn't need any help. Jackson Brown does. And we'll come back and talk about whether or not Section 5 of the 14th Amendment changes anything yet, or could. Matt Spalding rejoins us right after this. Stay tuned. Hillsdale.edu.
Do you believe in our founders' vision for America? That our republic will only survive if we are an educated and informed people who know our rights and duties. Since 1844, Hillsdale College has sought to educate all who wish to learn about these timeless principles of self-government. For more than 50 years, the college has worked to spread that mission by sending Imprimis to millions of Americans. Imprimis features some of the best speeches given at Hillsdale events, and now an audio version of the popular Speech Digest is available in a new podcast of the same name. And, like the print publication, Imprimis, the podcast, is always free. Listen to the best arguments from speakers such as Chris Rufo, Molly Hemingway, Mark Stein, and Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn, read by Hillsdale students. Subscribe today to listen to Imprimis at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.
Welcome back, America. This is the most important segment of today's Hillsdale Dialogue because it concerns the dissent of Justice Jackson Brown, joined by Justice Sotomayor and Kagan from Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. A dissent that is answered by Clarence Thomas eloquently. But Matt Spalding, a very smart man on the left by the name of Jonathan Cohn, wrote last night in the Huffington Post, the big thing Justice Jackson got right and Justice Thomas got wrong last week. I'm not persuaded, but I want to deal with the most difficult argument, which is people look around and they say there is systemic racism, and we know that because of the disparate impact of various rules over the centuries on black Americans and descendants of slaves. And if those actual disparate impact can be proven, Justice Brown Jackson argues, then you can remedy them under the 14th Amendment. I do not believe that is correct. Justice Thomas doesn't believe it's correct. But my argument is this. If you can prove that there is a systemic, lasting impact that was intentional at the beginning and endures, then Congress and the executive, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, to persuade the court that their remedy is lawful. But they may not do that either in the absence of the finding or the persuasion. What say you, Dean Spalding?
I'll take a yes and a no. I think your general assessment of that being the strongest point in the dissent is correct. I think the question where you're wanting to get to is, well, what can Congress do through Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, and in a way does that give them an opening to do more? And I think that the answer there, this is maybe subtle, but I think we agree here, is that, well, there's actually a lot that Congress can do, but they can't do it based on race. They must do it based on a broad sense of creating opportunities for everyone, including those. And Justice Thomas, I think, gives us the clearest answer on that when he talks about something called the anti-subordination view, which is there's this misunderstanding of the 14th Amendment, which is the 14th Amendment only forbids laws that hurt blacks as opposed to helps blacks. And thus this opens this possibility that we can do whatever we want in favor of assisting blacks based on race. And he says that's incorrect, but you can do things through the 14th Amendment as long as they're done in a way that does not do it based on racial classifications. That's what opens the argument up for doing things which create broad swaths of opportunity. And there are a couple of historical points that come up in the dissent and the concurrence, which I think make this very clear. That you can take something like the Freedmen's Act which was passed soon after the Civil War was over to help former slaves. That was clearly intent, but it is written in a way that does not necessarily base it on race per se. Take something like the Homestead Act, clearly intended to help former slaves and those whose lives were destroyed by the Civil War move west and get land and start farms. Did not make distinctions based on race. It was a broad way of creating opportunities. So Congress can create opportunities. They can do it in a way that will clearly have an effect on certain people, certain people that are disadvantaged. But you can't do it under the 14th Amendment based on racial classifications. I think that's what both Roberts and Thomas make crystal clear.
Unless
Dean,
unless you can prove that there was government discrimination at the beginning. For example, schools were segregated by law. After that was found unconstitutional, courts took over school systems and had race-conscious remedies, which was constitutional until the original sin was erased. Thereafter, even if the school resegregated on the basis of individuals making their own decisions on where to live in public school zoning, you could not then use it again. I just believe that if you can show, it's very hard to do, but if you can show that racial animus moved the government, then you can use race in the remedy. But that's the only time you can use it. Last word to you, Matt Spalding.
Well, but the question, but can you do it based on, in particular cases and in narrow cases? I think the answer to that is yes, but can you do it on a societal basis? I hear where you're coming from. I understand your point, but I'm very nervous, as is Justice Thomas, that once you start down that path, you've opened a door that is very dangerous. You can't hold the current generation responsible for the sins of hundreds of years ago. And that's extremely difficult and gets into lots of problems. But the more general thing here, I think, is that, as with the Dobbs decision for that matter, the court has withdrawn itself from making these expertise calls. They're not going to do a sociological experiment, but they have opened the opportunity for legislatures, in this case Congress in particular, to do things which advance a larger goal, which is to bring about more opportunity such that we can have a system based on equality, not racial distinctions.
And I want to go so far, and we'll continue the conversation. We may have a third founding on our hands. The first founding being the Declaration, the second being the Gettysburg Address, and the third being the repudiation of the Progressive Era underway by the Roberts Court. Dean Matt Spalding, Hillsdale.edu, all thank you so much. Great conversation with a man who has to actually implement the decision, both in the public and the private sector. It's amazing.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.